Hi, welcome to Public Affairs Public Access on Houston Media Source TV. I'm Gene Preuss with the League of Women Voters of Houston. We'd have a lot to cover in recent months over what's been going on, things that are affecting us. The elections are a few months away. There are questions about voting, what will be on the ballots, how will we vote. The COVID outbreak has caused numerous concerns and stories about who has control over public health protocols. They've affected us recording this show and being in studio or doing it as you can see now from my office. There's also concerns about schools opening, closing, businesses closing, stimulus payments, questions about our soldiers, their safety, and many other issues. Tonight, obviously we can't cover everything. So tonight what we're going to do is look at an ongoing issue. On May 25th, Houston native George Floyd died in police custody in Minneapolis, Minnesota. The incident was captured on video, and Floyd's death sparked outrage and protests across the nation, all the way back from Minnesota down here to his hometown of Houston. And it brought up in the minds of many echoes of what had happened to Sandra Bland, Trayvon Martin, Breonna Taylor, Michael Brown, just to name a few. So tonight we're going to talk about police reform and violence with Dr. Dwight Watson, Associate Professor of History at Texas State University in San Marcos, author of Race and the Houston Police Department, A Change Did Come, published in 2006 by Texas A&M University Press. Also an article in a recent Houston History magazine called In the Name of Progress and Decency, the response of Houston's civic leaders to the lynching of Robert Powell in 1928. Also with us this evening, in our second part, is Brandon Mack, an organizer with Black Lives Matter Houston, and he'll be discussing the organization and help us to clear up some misinformation that circulates on social media and to discuss what defund the police means. So thank you for joining us, and we'll begin our interviews in just a second. Dwight Watson, thank you very much for joining us today. I want to talk a little bit about your book and help you and ask you to help us put in perspective some of the issues going on right now, some of the complaints with policing and the Houston Police Department in specific. So you wrote a book called Race in the Houston Police Department. Tell us a little bit, are you a Houston native?
No, I'm not. I was born in Little Rock, Arkansas. I was 2 years old in 1957. And the Little Rock Nine were people in the community. My dad was actually a teacher at Dunbar. My mom had graduated a few years earlier. And so I moved to Texas in the fall of 1980, 81.
So what got you interested in writing about the Houston Police Department and the history of it and some of its racial issues?
Well, I was working at the University of Houston with Joe Pratt, former Cullen Professor of History and Business. He recommended looking at the relationship between the police and citizens in Houston. And I took it a step further. Rather than just create a book that examines Black folk in Houston and the police, I wanted to write a book about how change occurs in the police, a kind of institutional study that looks at how institutions make change when race is a critical barrier to change. And so I decided that I needed to talk to the police themselves. And so Joe and I worked out a way to meet the chief and the people. Louis Matafava at the time had read his study and realized it needed help. And so I wanted to do something, not just the police, but a broader study that looked at Houston history.
Police brutality was not something new, right? It stretches back. Can you talk a little bit about the history of some of the problems here in Houston that we've seen and how it compared with other parts of the country or the state even?
Well, when you hear the word traditional policing, you are usually talking about policing that stretches the boundaries of legality. You're talking about trying to impose a set of values or to control society using a set of values that may not be the shifting values of society itself. Police brutality, particularly in the 20s and 30s, was reflective of a changing need for police to grapple with an urbanizing society. Southern policing started so much later than Northern policing. And when, as a matter of fact, Northern cities, 1840s, 1850s, Boston, Lane, Chicago, all of those cities, Fox Dick, the professional manager, Southern cities didn't get professional managers until the 20th century, the second quarter of the 20th century, you know? Northern cities, as a result, had professional police managers, but police brutality had a lot to do with how we understood societal norms at the time. For example, it was normal for have corporal punishment. And so since the police were the enforcement arm for society, oftentimes their desire to set a person straight reflected a set of values that if you're dealing in law enforcement, you shouldn't do. Because there was, in my book, I talk about this guy who was called Tiny, I think it was his name, Mike or something, like a big guy. And he was known to stop young toughs and spank them, you know. But when criminality starts to rise during Prohibition, so did police aggression. As change starts to happen and the set of values shift in the criminal population, so does it happen in policing itself. Problem was they didn't have set of standards that were consistent for policing. Standards dictate how you become a police, how you're trained to become a police. And so what we found was early on, and particularly until the late 20s, early 30s, when Morrison and others take over in Houston, there was not a consistent regulation for training. That was not even consistent caliber gun that police carried. Oftentimes they bought their own gun. You know, they had everything from a 45 long coat to a 32. You know, most international police up until World War II carried a 32 caliber. They didn't carry the big guns to blow down a wall with. But in Houston, policing was unnecessarily aggressive. It becomes brutal, and it becomes brutal as the population rises. And as the population rises, there becomes a discussion about those who police serve and those who are policed. The more you are policed, the more aggressive the police are with you. And so Houston had a history of violence in the police function. And throughout history, there are some famous cases that people would end up being killed or people would end up with serious injuries. And usually there is a cry for reform when police brutality leads to a problem in the court system itself. The cases are going to be dismissed because you violated certain constitutional rights. And so Houston was no different than any other city. They grappled with the changes in society the only way a poorly trained and poorly educated force would: violence. With some. Because here's what they told me, and they told me this over and over when I interviewed people, was that we served the elite and we knew that. Our job was to protect the city and serve the will of the elites. And so if you were not part of that group and you were in the wrong part of town, Shepherd or any of the wards at night, you would find yourself on the mean end of the police function, particularly Fifth Ward, uh, uh, Third Ward, and Fourth Ward. There seemed to be at one point, and I couldn't get the actual statute or anything that was written, but I think it was just an in-house policy that if somebody's out after a certain time, then they're up to no good. And so the police were able to make certain kind of value judgments, and that would often lead to aggression. But we can't talk about this and not understand how much race had to do with this in Houston. Remember, Houston is unique. It has a Black police officer from the 1880s, 1870s actually, all the way through. It have at least one or two Black police officers, and they had a legitimate function. Two were hired by the force, and you had other special officers who provided a function for the police in times of social tension. And that's what the police give you a badge, and they called upon you as a civic leader to go out and help the police. This was different than any other Southern place, except San Antonio, Texas, who had a triracial police system and accepted and understood the necessity of having minorities as police officers. But the rules of race in Texas dictated that they policed, at least the minorities, policed people of their own ilk or kind. They did not break down that in Houston until the late 50s, 58, 59, where you could arrest a white person and not fear punishment. But E.J. Stringfellow said to me, we could do it, but it wasn't wise to do it.
Let's talk about post-World War II, because you say that this is when the change, and in fact, the title of your book is A Change Did Come. And so you do talk about the reforms and the changes that the police department made. So what was it about World War II that precipitated these changes?
Number one, there was a rise in education through the GI Bill. And education doesn't change everything, but it does impact some things. It impacts perception and understanding. And so even though you did have discrimination and stuff, you seem to have a higher standard of policing being required of police themselves. And the more enlightened a group is, oftentimes you find them to be less aggressive, sometimes less violent, and to a certain degree, a different kind of racist, not as overt, not as direct in your face kind of thing, more benign in terms of actions and attitude. It's in attitude and it's in policy, which is a whole different issue at that. And so after the war, you had Black veterans coming, and they were expecting the double victory. And Houston increases the numbers, but they had to, because you got to look at Black population in Houston. Now remember, in 1960, the Black population in Houston would have been the 12th largest city in the country. And so the Houston Police Department didn't do Blacks a favor. They did themselves a favor by increasing the numbers commensurate to reflect the growth in the population. It has never been commensurate to the number in society. So after World War II, veterans came home with a different set of expectations. But Black vets went to college. They went to college, we're using the GI Bill. And some of the first police officers in the increased numbers of police officers, 58, 57, 58 on, they will come to the police officer representing a police officer that is totally different. They come in with college education. not just school, they got degrees in hand. And if they hadn't gone to a 4-year school, they had gone to a 2-year school, and they either had a degree or they had a completed skill level functioning. Like Oliver Brown was a carpenter as well as a countryman who was working at the Cotton Exchange. E.J. Stringfellow, college education, but didn't graduate. Some of the first Black detectives, Mr. Black, had a master's degree in biology, was headed to medical school or dental school, he said. But the police called him first. Becomes one of the first detectives, Black detectives.
To apply some history to what's going on today, and it's not just today. I mean, go back to Ferguson and some other things, but I think it's interesting that you bring out that it was education, training, and then also accountability, right? By voting that made all these changes possible. What about some of the things going on today, like with Sandra Bland, just up the road from us here, Trayvon Martin, and then you've got George Floyd and others who have been mistreated by police officers. Now, granted that some police officers themselves are trying to correct that situation. So, but there is still this idea that there's a lot of things that can go wrong. How do you address this when students or other people ask you about this?
Well, students tend to ask you blunt questions. How did he get away with killing Sandra Bland? How did he get away with that? And I said, Sandra Bland, number one, never should have went to jail. Number two, here's a term that we hear a lot of, bias. In my day, it was prejudice. And ironically, this officer had internalized the cultural prejudice of some in the institution. And remember, there's always that segment. And when you're trying to impress that segment to be one of the boys, oftentimes people take it literally, their line of authority. Authority grants power. And in Sandra Bland, it was an execution of that kind of power, that you had the sole determination what happens to a person. And if you look at it, he ends up in jail because of some of those decisions. Trayvon Martin was an outright killing of a kid. But why didn't Zimmerman go to jail? Because a jury of his peers, not a jury of Martin's peers, a jury of his peers. And that is the key in any case where fear matrix is involved, including the police. Police often get off because they find a jury sympathetic to the function of policing. In the case of Trayvon, they found a jury sympathetic to Zimmerman's idea of fear. And even though this was a child, remember, in American culture from the late 1920s forward, there seems to be no differentiation between a Black child and a Black man. And in a certain segment of the country, that still persists. And the case of Floyd is a tragedy. This was a tragedy that a ticket could have taken care of. But I think we're going to find out that there was a lot more going on with that officer than with George Floyd. George Floyd lost his life. But what we will find is that that officer had some issues, and some of those issues may have been extreme prejudice. Some of those issues may have been the fact that George Floyd had a power relationship with him, he thought, at the bar that they worked at, because George bought him his money and stuff. And so he was trying to show George this was his place. Problem is, when somebody's life is involved, when you get to fighting, I've had fights before as a football player, you kind of lose it. And But as a police officer, you have to always have that professional decorum. That's why they started to say when there is a fight between a police officer and a suspect, that another officer should take over the arrest when that officer appears, because you won't have what happened with Torres. But in this case, during the arrest is what happened here. This man they took him out the car. All he had to do was close the door. That's all he had to do. He was long and tall. He couldn't raise his feet up and kick the window or anything. Just close the door. But this was about showing him who was in charge and who was in control. Remember, man, ego is something. Somebody says, well, Dwight, how do you know that? One of the things police officers rely on is instinct. When you buttress instinct with deadly force, sometimes lives are lost as a result of that, because instinct overrides the legality. I know he did something wrong. Well, you're not the court. I used to have to tell people at the prison that these guys are locked up 24 hours a day. That's all they got to do is think about how to get around the rules. And so why are we upset with them for breaking the rules? Lock him up, take him to disciplinary court and give him his punishment. It ain't personal, However, most of the prison abuse cases come from people who can't make that distinction and differentiation. Police are just as guilty of that. So what did Floyd represent? He represented the final point of departure. I can call names out going back to the 60s of people who've been murdered or killed in police custody. If killed is better for people, so killed in police custody instead of murdered. But George Floyd was murdered. This guy simply went somewhere. I don't know where he went, but he was not there. He put his hand in his pocket as if he was not on the neck of a man. I watched it again, I listened. And while it bothered me, I had to try to step away from it to understand what was going on. And what I saw was that the senior officer on the place was violating the rules of conduct of that department. Because field training is the place where most of the training of police go awry. Not the academy, not what they understand or learn. It is how they implement it when they get to work. That's what started to happen. Remember the guy said I had to ask the supervisor, who was that man, what to do. And somebody says, well, they should be. I would bet that the younger officers will be found guilty of lesser and included offenses and given a sentence less than 5 years because of the nature of the crime. I think this may be one case, because Minnesota's had some cases similar to this. This guy may go to jail, and because this case is somewhat of an anomaly, they think, but it really isn't. People who have bias and skirt the rules lose it a lot. People just don't file reports because they're afraid. We came from a community where people internalize what happens to them rather than report it. Because who are you going to tell?
So this brings up a very important question as far as police relating to the community, and I even hear this from police officers and police chiefs who say the same thing. Is that you get communities that are historically oppressed by police. They're not going to go to the police, and so or you have history where police used to not go into certain neighborhoods themselves.
Yeah.
And so who do they turn to? And so this just exacerbates and creates this circle of criminality that and victimization that is allowed to perpetuate. What is, is that the only problem, or are there other issues whenever you can't trust the police?
There are other systemic issues. Institutional neglect on the part of those who make rules and regulations. Try to get a pothole fixed in a neighborhood, inner city neighborhood, but watch them fix Lamar Street in Houston. You see how fast they'll do that, or watch them fix Kirby, if necessary. I lived in Houston a long time, so the streets are notoriously bad, but there are certain areas that get the street fixed quicker. And people know that, and this has been history. The water stands in my neighborhood, but doesn't stand in that neighborhood. People know that. I used to work for Storm Sewer. You go out and clean the drain out, and water goes down, Man, this is it's a hard question for people to understand, but I got the answer in my head. It is that you only deal with people you have some trust in. A lot of times, poor people will call the police as a punishment to another person. But there are some pockets in communities where police and the citizens get along fine. And ironically, I lived in Little Rock where police didn't hassle folks. 2 blocks over, they did, you see. I grew up in East Little Rock, Arkansas, which is a really lower class, working class community. And I have never been stopped by the police, never been hassled, never had handcuffs on, other than the ones I had just to see what they felt like. I mean, honestly. But I am the only person in my group of 12 guys that grew up together that can say that. Some of it has to do with the fact that I watch pretty well. I look out, I kind of comport myself. The other part is there's some people the police don't bother. And I can't explain it to people. That's the person. And if you grew up in a neighborhood, there's a guy that nobody mess with. Yeah, I tended to be that guy. And I don't know why, but it also helped me to look and see what attracted police to my friends, you see? And if you already have a bias and somebody is nervous around you, that makes you think they have something to hide. And so here it is, police take their biases with them to a community that is suspicious and fearful. And my friends would never say they're fearful, but his uncle was killed by the police in a chokehold, you see, in 1980s. He was a Korean War veteran who was shell-shocked, and that's the term they use for post-traumatic stress. And I never will forget it. The nicest guy you'd ever meet in your life, but his mind was gone. And he was off his medicine. They were trying to explain to him, hey. And the police, he was huge, big, strong fella, about 60 years old at the time. And the chokehold killed him. And because he was huge and they were trying to fight him to subdue him, they walked away from that. He was a hero, I think he had a Bronze Star even. So when we police certain people and we serve others, that dual system of policing breaks down our society's understanding of policing.
Good evening. And tonight I'm talking with Brandon Mack, who is with Black Lives Matter Houston. Mr. Mack, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. Happy to be here.
Tonight I want to talk a little bit about Black Lives Matters. We here in Houston, we had protests over the George Floyd incident, and we just discussed with Dwight Watson, a professor of history at Texas State, about the long history of racial animosity within the Houston Police Department and efforts that have been made over the years to try to address some of those issues, but there's still problems. And so tell us what Black Lives Matter, what does that really mean?
Sure. So, first and foremost, as I like to explain to people what Black Lives Matter is, you can think of it in three ways. First and foremost is a simple declarative statement. It means purely that Black Lives Matter, because in the United States, but also globally, anti-Blackness is a problem in the fact that we do not value the lives of Black people equally. Because if that were true, we wouldn't see the racial inequities that we see in healthcare, in relation to how we're treated by the police, and in various other spheres of our world. So when we say Black Lives Matter, we're saying that as, once again, a simple declarative statement that our lives inherently matter because of who we are. And so that's the reason for why you'll see that first and foremost is just a declarative statement. It started out as a hashtag in 2013 in response to the Trayvon Martin case by the three founders of the hashtag. And then it kind of developed from there into what I often say is the second way of looking at it, as a movement. It is a movement in terms of we are advocating for and making sure that we address the racial inequities related to police brutality, but also related to economic injustice, educational inequalities, and once again, all those different spheres of influence where we're seeing the devaluation of Black life and making sure that our specific issues are addressed. And then third and finally, it is an organization. Black Lives Matter operates as chapters within local cities, and it is a decentralized model where while there is one national organization, Black Lives Matter operates however it needs to operate within your city so that it is addressing the issues specifically within your cities rather than using a top-down approach where the top organization decides what the agenda is and then it trickles on down to everybody else. We get to set the agenda of what needs to be done here in Houston as Black Lives Matter Houston. So once again, just for everyone's understanding, Black Lives Matter isn't just one thing, it is multiple things. First and foremost is a simple declarative statement where we state that our lives as Black people and that Black lives simply matter. Second, it is a movement where we are addressing issues of a concern to the Black community. And then third and finally, it is an organization.
So I think that it's a very interesting statement that you just made about that each chapter, each group in a locale can set their own agenda, as it were. So there is an overarching sentiment and an overarching direction, but it can be localized. So Black Lives Matter San Antonio or Houston or Dallas or a smaller town like Temple or in Brownsville, they may not all have the same focus and direction. Well, they have the same direction and focus, but they may not all operate the same way. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. So, for example, we're in the process of helping Galveston to establish their own Black Lives Matter chapter to where they're going to deal with the issues that are important to the Galveston community. Because while we are close to each other, Houston and Galveston, there are specific incidences and issues that are of concern here in Houston that might not be the same issues that the individuals in Galveston are facing. So once again, this gives us the ability of, once again, working together and being under the central guiding principle and message of Black Lives Matter, but once again gives us the ability to operate in the ways in which we need to operate to best address the issues that are happening here in Houston.
And as you bring out, it is a relatively new organization. Can you tell us something about how the Black Lives Matter movement, as you mentioned, it originally started off as a hashtag. How did it get started? You mentioned Trayvon Martin, but can you go into a little bit more detail, please?
Sure. So it started in 2013 in response to Black Lives Matter, in response to Trayvon Martin. There are three founders of the hashtag. That would be Opal Tometi, Alicia Garza, and Patrice Cullors. So when they collectively started it, it was to bring attention to the way people were feeling with respect to George Zimmerman not being convicted of the murder of Trayvon Martin. And then it kind of developed from there into the other nationwide incidences that got a lot of attention, such as Mike Brown, Rekia Boyd, Sandra Bland. That's how it initially started, in terms of we were consistently seeing for a very small window of time an issue that we as Black people have been dealing with for hundreds of years. And once again, that is the devaluation of Black life, and also the fact that Black people were being disproportionately targeted and killed in police officer involved shootings and killings. And they wanted to use that hashtag to bring attention to that, but also to bring attention once again Black lives simply matter, and that if we're really going to address this, we need to address all the issues surrounding why are we treated differently, and why are our issues not given the same attention, and therefore our lives are not as valued as equally as everyone else. From there, it did spawn into an actual organization and a movement. There is a Black Lives Matter national organization that the original founders are the heads of, and then, chapters after that sprang up in the way that they sprang up. One thing that we're very intentional about, once again, is that every single city gets to operate in the way that they operate, because we don't want to use the same organizational structures that are not based in centering the Black experience and in centering the way that we as a Black community operate. So that's the reason why you're not going to see it in a very traditional structure that you may see with other organizations, just because we're not going to apply those frameworks that weren't built with us in mind.
I think that's very important that you say this, because it seems that throughout our history, we have tended to take minority groups, and we're talking about African Americans in this discussion, but to kind of generalize them and say they all feel this way, they all act this way, they all think this way. And I think that this, the way you describe the local organizations being able to have some direction, really kind of runs in the face of that. So it's saying that not everybody is facing the exact same things everywhere, and that the organization has to be flexible enough to adapt.
I definitely would agree with that, because once again, as I mentioned, anti-Blackness is a global problem, but the way that it operationalizes and functions is going to be very specific to that experience, because once again, the Black experience is not monolithic. So we all face similar devaluation in terms of when people immediately see me, they're going to immediately see my Black skin. But then, of course, I have all these other intersections that are very important to my own identity that are also operating simultaneously. And then also, because I live here in Houston, Texas, I'm going to deal with the issues that are specifically here in Houston, Texas, that may be very different than a Black person who's living in Nigeria, who is dealing with an international context, but we're both dealing with very similar situations, given the fact that we live and operate in a world that sees our Black skin first and then makes all these assumptions, and then it also impacts how they interact with us as people.
So what are some of the issues that the BLM movement in Houston are working on?
So one of the first and foremost things that we're dealing with is, of course, criminal justice reform. And as part of that criminal justice reform, it is dealing with incidences that involve officer-involved shootings. Here in the city of Houston, we have to be mindful that we have had several of our own incidences, such as Nicholas Chavez, Adrian Medeiros, and many other cases where it has been Black and brown people being killed in officer-involved shootings, and families not getting redressed for those particular issues, but also the community not getting a sense of what happened in those issues. So we're calling for more transparency. We are seeing that the city of Houston, of course, is trying to do task force, but task force are not enough. We need actual action. So where are the policy changes? Where are the reforms within the police department in terms of providing that greater transparency? So criminal justice reform is one element that we definitely work on with respect to officer-involved shootings, but also are these are these cases being treated at every level? Are they being treated equally at the local level with the district attorneys? Are they being treated the same way statewide in terms of state legislation? So that's one plank. Another element that we definitely work on is education. We do know that education, unfortunately, is very disproportionate in terms of the amount of resources that are given to Black and Brown schools. So we saw, especially with recapture happening here in the state of Texas, that disproportionately impacted schools here in Houston. So we advocate and work with HISD to make sure that the policies and procedures are being equitable for Black and Brown students, but we also fill in the gap by teaching students about Black history so that they have that Black pride to see that inherently, once again, their Black lives matter and that they come from a history that they can be prideful in. We work on food insecurity because coming from a place of lack leads to all of these other issues. We also deal with COVID-19 response, so we're dealing with healthcare. We actually have provided gift cards and other resources to families in need that they're not able to get from other social services. So the reason why we do all of these different issues is because they're all connected to one. None of these are done simply in isolation. If you're not getting equitable education, then that, of course, is going to have an impact in terms of your health care and your health outcomes, which could also lead to lack in terms of the resources you need to secure your home, which then could lead to, well, why is it that you're having an interaction with the police department when they're being told to interact with the homeless population rather than other entities doing that work? So once again, all these issues are connected and we work on all of these different issues. And those are just a few of the ones we work on, but there's a variety of different issues that we work on.
So you're doing more than just protesting.
Protesting is just one thing in our toolbox, as I like to tell people. We not only protest, but we definitely do that. We also do rallies. We also do lobbying efforts. We educate people on issues, as well as educating people as to who do you need to go to address these issues. Because many people get angry and upset and think, oh, it's the president of the United States who's the person who has control over that issue. Well, that's not who has control of those issues. If you want to see improvements in terms of your roads, that means you need to contact the city of Houston. You need to contact county government. If you want to see changes in terms of evictions, that's going to once again be the county, and it's also going to be the justice of the peace. So that's also an important component of what we do, is educating who do we need to go to get our issues addressed, and then we go directly to those individuals and start working on policies and changes to make sure that we do get equitable changes that will directly impact us as a Houston community.
I'm glad you brought that up because, one of the important things about the League of Women Voters is we want people to go out and vote and to realize that all elections, while the presidential election or the big national elections get a lot of the media, sometimes it's the local elections that directly affect us on a day-to-day basis. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. As we often tell people, you have to go all the way down to the ballot, because the closer you get to the end of that ballot, the closer you're going to get to what affects you. So President of the United States, yes, they impact federal policy, but it's really those local and state policies that are going to impact you way more. So that's the reason why it's important that you go all the way down to the ballot, because once again, constables have a lot to do with respect to evictions. It's our county government that are going to have access and control over the health department system, elements of education, as well as with respect to police brutality, because if you want to see changes with respect to the police, you got to work with your city and your county. So that's why it's so very important that we are educated and care about local elections, because that's where it's going to impact you the most.
You're giving us some education about the Black Lives Matter movement, what you stand for, and some of the activities that the organization involves in. So I want to ask you to respond to some of the things I see on Facebook and other social media about Black Lives Matter. So the number one thing that you always hear is like, well, don't all lives matter?
The reason why you should not say that is because, once again, Black Lives Matter is a declarative statement. We're clearly saying that our lives matter, and the reason for why we're having to say that is because they don't inherently matter. If Black lives truly inherently mattered, you wouldn't see disproportionate incidences related to police brutality. You wouldn't see sentencing inequities. You wouldn't see food insecurities that mostly predominantly impact the Black community. You would see equitable allocations of resources related to education for Black people. So that's the reason for why we have to be very, very distinctive when we say Black Lives Matter, because we're trying to get to the place where we have racial equity. So whenever anyone says that statement, the correct statement is always Black Lives Matter. Well, all lives matter won't matter until Black Lives Matter, because right now that's not happening in this particular situation. So that's what I always say to people when they say that, is that what we are saying is we have to remind ourselves that our lives matter, and we have to say that to everyone else, because if that was a true statement, what they are saying in response to that, then these inequities wouldn't exist.
One of the other things that I often see today in the news is that the defund the police movement. And there seems to be a lot of debate over what that really means. On the one hand, I recently saw, I think, Cliven Bundy, who was the separatist leader in the Midwest, said, look, he agrees with defund the police because he thinks the police, and so he agrees with the Black Lives Matter movement in that. On the other hand, you do see other people say, look, I don't, I may think I may have problems with the way police operate, but I still want to be able to call 911 and get help when I need it. Do we, and now we're seeing reports that police are being defunded. Let's talk about that for a minute. What does that mean? Do you not want police?
So once again, let's think back to where did this system come from and the remnants of it. So when we think about the police system, I want everyone to be reminded of the fact that the earliest police that we saw in the United States were slave catchers. So these were individuals who were tasked with the ability to go after Black people who were slaves and running away from the conditions of slavery. So inherently, early police started out with a negative mindset related to Black people. Police culture gets passed down and keeps getting maintained. So therefore, the system itself was already built from an anti-Blackness framework. So one of the reasons for why you're seeing people calling for the abolishment of police and the defunding of police is because of that foundation on which the system was created. They want to see something different. Now, many people say, oh, there's training, oh, there's, hiring people, they're more diverse police officers. The culture still gets passed down. So even if you do have more diverse cops, and even if you have more training, if that culture hasn't been changed, it's still there to where it negates all of that training and all of those diversity efforts. So hence, one of the options is to abolish the police to where we create a new system where it's no longer built off of that previous foundation. So that's one element that I want to bring up. With respect to defunding the police, it once again is about what does this system currently have access to and is control over. Unfortunately, police get called for a variety of situations that many of them are not trained for and shouldn't probably be called for. So for example, if someone is going through a mental health issue, oftentimes it is the police who are the first ones who are called and are in response to that, rather than it being a social worker or a psychiatrist, someone who's more trained to realize the signs that this person isn't engaging in criminal behavior, they're going through a mental health episode. So when people call for the defunding of police, what they're calling for is the reallocation of those resources that are going towards those functions that police are being expected to. Instead of it going to police, it would now go to more, social programs. It would go towards increasing the number of social workers, increasing the number of psychiatrists and psychologists who would then be in response to those particular issues. It could also go towards more funds for the homeless, because many times, even here in the city of Houston, police are called to address issues with the homeless population. And all these individuals are trying to do is to find a place for shelter and to find a meal. Well, if we use those funds instead of cops having to respond to those particular calls, two more shelters, two more programs that would give them an ability to secure a home, we would address those issues. So that's what the call for defunding of the police is going towards. It is going towards the reallocation of those particular funds towards going towards the issues that are supposedly going to be addressed by our police. Now, I know that one of the biggest things that people often fear is who's going to protect us. Let's be honest about that. Do police really protect us at this particular point? If that were true, we wouldn't see the rises in murders that we're seeing. We wouldn't necessarily, we would see more closure of cases and things of that nature. So I think that the one thing that people also need to just be open to thinking about is that we can still have protection. We can still have systems in place. It's just it can just look very differently than the current system that we have, because clearly the system is broken. And now we're calling for alternative ways to be able to address this. So one thing that I'm going to be very interested in, and I think many other individuals are going to be very interested in, is what happens in these cities where we do see the dismantling of police departments, the funding of police, and seeing, are there any increased incidences, or are there more equity now because they reimagined what the system is?
What ways could dialogues or conversations be started that would further the concerns that BLM has?
Definitely think that dialogue is possible, but it also needs to be done on equal footing. One of the things that I think that makes it very, very hard is that even when you want to engage in a conversation with police officers, many times they won't do it as plainclothes individuals. They feel that they need to come still with brandishing a gun and brandishing a weapon. Well, how am I supposed to feel if that I'm a civilian and I understand that you're coming to me with this and you are in your role as a police officer? Well, how are we going to have an equitable conversation if you come brandishing a weapon and brandishing a gun? So that automatically starts it off as an unequal conversation. So I really feel that if we want to have really effective dialogue and conversations, it needs to be done on an equal footing, first and foremost. Secondly, I think that greater transparency, aside from just saying, oh, we tried to do this or there's nothing that can be done, that doesn't help the situation either. There needs to be some signs that there is actual real work going on with that, rather than things that are symbolic. And I think that that's also the problem that we're seeing, is that we're seeing way more symbolic gestures rather than seeing actual change and actual changes in behavior and policy. So it needs to be a two-way street. You can't just simply think that the society and that the citizens are the ones that have to change. Police officers also need to demonstrate that they're making changes as well. Because one thing that I think has also been very, very ineffective in the conversations that I've seen between police and citizens is that police come in and always tell citizens what they need to be doing, rather than it being, well, what are you going to do to change your behavior? So if it comes that way, that's once again demonstrating that this is not a dialogue. This is you privileging yourself more above us as citizens and talking down to us. That's not a dialogue. So if we really want that to happen, it needs to be a full dialogue with equal participants who are willing to do equal amounts of work.
Not all policemen are white. And there are policemen we talk about how African Americans are disproportionately affected by police officers. Some of that is by other Black officers. So how can that be racist if you have Black officers or other minority officers who are doing the same things to minority suspects?
It's once again, what is the basis of the treatment? If the basis of the negative treatment is because of a person's race, then it is racist. If you are, let me put it this way, we criminalize Black people just for existence. And once again, it goes back to that start of slavery. We were viewed as being criminals from running away from being beaten, running away from being subjugated. So we get criminalized automatically just for existence. So if you approach me automatically thinking that I'm engaging in something bad, you're engaging in racism, because the negative behavior that you're basing your assumptions on are based in a racist format, or based in a racist ideology. So, and once again, I go back to police culture. Police culture is something that is passed down, and it is something that even minority officers can take on. So if you're not challenging that and you're just accepting that, you're also engaging in racist ideologies and practices that are based in racism. So even though you are a person who is non-white, you can be contributing to racism based off of the actions, mindsets, and the way that you're approaching people on the basis of race.
If somebody wants to find out more information about BLM in Houston or BLM in general, where can they go?
You can absolutely contact us through our website. Our website is blmhouston.com. You can always email us at blmhou@gmail.com. And if you have those questions, as I mentioned, don't be afraid to be able to ask those questions through that email address. We're also very active on social media. If you want to get more involved in terms of actions and things of that nature that you can do on the ground, we definitely encourage you to follow our social media. We have Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and it's at BLMHOU.
Brandon Mack, thank you very much. I appreciate your taking your time out to be on the show today.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for joining us this evening, and I want to thank Dwight Watson, Associate Professor of History at Texas State University in San Marcos, and Brandon Mack, organizer with Black Lives Matter Houston, for being on the show this evening. And I want to thank you for having us in your homes, and we'll see you next month on Public Affairs Public Access on Houston Media Source. For the League of Women Voters, I'm Gene Preuss.